So hello and welcome to Family Smart's Monthly in the Know. My name is Victoria Keddis and I'm a mom of two young adults who are also my greatest teachers. I'm also a manager and facilitator with FamilySmart. With gratitude, we acknowledge that we are on the unceded traditional territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Musqueam nations. We know relationships matter, and we commit to building and strengthening our connections with the First Peoples on whose land we live, love, and work. I have the honor of hosting this conversation about eating disorders. If you're joining us today, it means you have questions or concerns about eating disorders and someone you care about. I'm joined by Rylee, Terri, and Carmen, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves. And Rylee, let's start with you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rylee McKinlay, and I'm a person with lived experience with the eating disorder. And then I also work at Foundry Penticton as a peer support worker. And the land that I'm on today is the unceded territory of the Syilx people.
Thank you. Terri.
Hi, everyone. I'm Terri McKinlay. I'm a mother of two daughters, and I am a peer support worker to families and a mental health advocate with lived experience. I'm also on the unceded and traditional territory of the Syilx people today.
And hi, I'm Carmen Kaufmann. I am a graduate of clinical social work and a certified personal trainer and a certified sports nutritionist. So I also have a private practice here on the North Shore, but here today I am here representing Jesse's Legacy, which is a provincial eating disorders prevention program. And what I do for them is I promote education, understanding, and prevention strategies for basically across the province of BC.
Great. Thank you so much, all of you, for being here with me today. So before we begin to what an eating disorder is, I want to start with what it's like to live with an eating disorder. So Rylee, I'm wondering if you can share your experience with eating disorders and what it felt like for you.
So I'm 25 now. When my eating disorder first started, I was 15 years old. And as we all know, that's a time of huge change socially and physically. And so thinking back to what it felt like, sometimes it's difficult because with eating disorders, especially with anorexia, which is what I had, once the weight dips below a certain point, you get into kind of a brain disintegration, just like the rest of your organs are starting to break down. You're losing a bit of cognitive function in your brain. So that time for me is really foggy, kind of clouded memories. I even kind of have lost a lot of memories from that time. But in general, what it felt like was, it felt like I had something else inside me controlling my thoughts once it got to a certain point. At first, it felt like it was me making these decisions to restrict and to overexercise. But as it progressed, it really began to feel like I was almost like possessed by something. I really had no control over what I thought or did. It felt like I had this voice telling me that the most important thing was to lose and to restrict. So really, yeah, a loss of control and a loss of myself. It felt like I lost who I was during that time.
I can't imagine what that would be like. And Terri, as a mom, I'm wondering what it was like for you watching this while it was happening for your daughter.
It was absolutely terrifying and overwhelming. It happened really quickly. It went from, at the beginning, it seemed like she was making healthy choices. She was choosing to eat more healthy even than before. She was exercising more, training, and she assured us that these were good things, that it was these are healthy choices. And then very quickly we realized that something wasn't right. Some of that was physical changes in Rylee, but mostly, like she said, it was she wasn't herself. It was more the behavioral, emotional, and mental changes. She was just someone we didn't recognize. She acted so differently than the daughter we knew, and we just had no. We couldn't believe how strong she was in terms of her resolve in this. She would not listen to any reasoning or any of the things we tried. It felt like a runaway train at times. It was terrifying because we didn't yet understand, like Rylee explained, that it wasn't her who was really in control. So we thought Rylee, our daughter, who we knew so well and were so close with, was choosing this, and we were just baffled. Along with that intense fear and confusion, we also felt the isolation, I think, that many families do when they're living with a mental illness in the family.
Mm-hmm. Thank you both for sharing and giving our viewers an opportunity to hear what this has been like for you. And I'm honored that you're sharing your story and experiences with us. So Carmen, you support families and people living with eating disorders, and we know this is one experience of what an eating disorder can look like. Can you tell us what is an eating disorder and how can it show up?
When I explain eating disorders, I try to get people to visualize a continuum, where at one end of the continuum, we have people who are feeling pretty generally okay about who they are and their body ideal, and they're eating. They're in a okay place. And as we move through the continuum, and there's various disordered behaviors along that continuum that, left unchecked and encouraged by society, because we live in a diet culture, that can turn into a full-blown eating disorder diagnosis, like anorexia, bulimia, and binge eating disorder. But what we want to be able to do is intervene before these behaviors, which I'll talk about, kind of take on a life of their own and become a habitual kind of problem for the person, where they start to lose control, which is what Terri was alluding to, is that her daughter wasn't no longer there. It was, her resolve was amazing, and how strong that can become. And we have to remember that, especially with youth, they're going through a huge developmental stage at this point. They're supposed to be growing and gaining weight. And at this point, if somebody's doing these restricting types of behaviors, they're really stagnating their actual physical development. So it can get very serious very fast. The number one behavior we see on the continuum that's been proven over and over again that really helps somebody progress through towards an eating disorder is starting to diet. So any diet, doesn't matter which one it is, but it's any kind of restriction. And we always have to remember too that boys, transgendered, and non-binary individuals also are not immune to these pressures in society. And they also are exposed to unrealistic ideals of what their body should look like. And not just unrealistic, they're also like just not genetically possible to achieve. And some of the behaviors you'll see throughout the continuum is, of course, dieting is one of the ones that everybody tends to do. And it's actually accepted and expected, and it's considered normal. And we move into fasting, which we see lots of that going on. We see lots of people advertising cleanses. And these are just different ways to lower calories. We get into exercise, and Rylee's was talking about it, how it was exercise at first, but then it kind of takes on a life of its own for a different purpose. It's no longer for fun and fitness. It's moving into really trying to control body shape and size. And we can see supplement or steroid abuse, further restricting. We see purge behaviors, which can be purge can be either by vomiting or over-exercise or using supplements or laxatives to get rid of the weight or water weight that they're not wanting. A new one that's out there, people call it clean eating. And this is really big in the fitness field, but it's another word for a diet. And it's basically taking the pleasure out of food, and it's just basically eating for sole function of food, which we know in our society that's just not a realistic way to live long term. So they all of a sudden are starting to exclude food groups, and all excluding food groups does is, again, decrease your amount of calories. So if somebody's coming and starting to do some of these behaviors without any real rationale behind it, like I can understand somebody becoming a vegetarian, but what's the rationale behind it? Explore that a bit. Is this really what's going on? Or are these just hidden ways for somebody to start to participate in more disordered eating behaviors?
So, Carmen, one of the things you spoke about was the continuum, and I'm wondering, Rylee, if you can speak to what that was like for you and your continuum of this in your life.
Yeah. So I was always active. I played lots of sports. And so exercising and training was always kind of just a normal part of my life. And I had never really, my concept of my body and myself in my mind, it hadn't really developed yet. I wasn't really aware of it as something other than the thing that I play in. But I can remember specifically one day in middle school, so I would have been probably about 14, a comment that a boy made about my body. And that was the first time I went home that night and looked in the mirror and looked at it objectively and thought, okay, well, there's that, and there's this, and there's that. And then I looked at it up against, I think I used to buy a lot of magazines back before Instagram totally took over. And I looked at it against one of the athletes in my magazine and I thought, well, I don't look like that. I should probably change. I should probably work on that. And so I remember that night I made a list. I want to change this, 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 and this. And so that was the point where I kind of, my mind shifted in my concept of myself and my body. From there, I started exercising more purposefully. So not just training to be better at my sports, but training to lose weight, to burn calories, to look different. As that progressed, it became addictive. So I became very exercise dependent. When my moods were unstable, I would turn to exercise to stabilize them. And it got to the point where it was like a drug to me. If I couldn't have my fix, if I couldn't go for my run, it was full panic time. I didn't know what to do with myself. I needed those endorphins. And so obviously this was becoming an unhealthy relationship with exercise. And at the same time, I was starting to diet. I don't know if you remember the Dukan diet that came out, that the Queen was doing it. And you just ate chicken breasts. And so I remember trying that one. And then I tried another one. And then I tried another one. And then I think I went vegetarian. And at school, I was losing weight. And so I was getting tons of compliments. Like in no way was I overweight before, but just I was slimming down. And about 10 years ago, I guess the kind of ideal body shape was still a little bit on the thin side. People, the Mary-Kate and Ashley Olsen look of having that really like small hips and little. So I was getting compliments about my weight loss, and it was making me feel great. The girls at school would say, I wish I could have as much restraint as you and just eat what you do in a day, which was a grapefruit and something. And so I was getting validated constantly. But then on the other hand, I was really starting to feel like I was losing control of myself. I felt like I was so dependent on following these strict behaviors, and that if I deviated from them in any way, the world would end. And so it just kept going. It just snowballed. All of a sudden, I had no control left at all. I was completely under what felt like the control of some separate entity that was telling me all these things. And in my mind, the moralization of food and exercise really became a big thing. And it was enforced by society that if you exercise and restrict, you are good. And if you are lazy and eat, you are bad. And then there are good, clean foods and there are bad foods. And so in my mind, everything was very, very black and white. And by the time it got to the point where I had to be hospitalized, I barely even really remember much of that time. But the things that kept me going, and kind of as I'd slip deeper and deeper into it, there were just little triggers. Like bullying had always been a thing. But once I kind of started on this path, in my mind, I thought, well, I'm going to show them. I'm going to be skinnier than them. And I thought I'll show the bullies that way. And school had always been stressful, but now it was, well, school doesn't really matter that much as long as I can maintain these habits. So when people ask like what caused it, I think of it as it's a genetic disease, but I think of it as this myriad of factors, and it was a loaded gun with the genetic portion. And then all these factors came together to pull the trigger and actually launch the disorder. But so it wasn't one event or one thing. It was a culmination of events that really led to it. But in the end, it really just felt like I had no control whatsoever.
One thing that we found validating, to kind of go off what Rylee said there, is that we learned that often people with anorexia have a perfectionistic type personality, a really driven personality. And so Rylee was always a really driven person and worked really hard at things for what she wanted. And in everything she tried really hard. So I guess part of I think that maybe fogged the obvious change there for us. It wasn't like black and white where she was doing something obviously different. She was still acting like Rylee at the beginning, just she was driven about something different right now. So I think that can blur those lines a little bit sometimes for parents too, when their kids already have that really driven personality. So obviously we figured it out along the way that something was really wrong. Like when Rylee talked about her not being in control, but there was a time there for sure where we weren't sure if this was something really bad, because it was fairly typical of Rylee's type of behavior, if that makes sense.
I think of you, Terri, as a mom, when you're first seeing all this going on and being excited for Rylee to be taking care of her health and having some good habits in place. There's a lot I know you wish you would have known, so that you could have had some early intervention in that. But what would you want parents to know, knowing what you've been through and knowing now what some of this alluded to prior to you understanding what it was?
Well, like I said before, one of the most important things would have been an earlier understanding around how it really takes over so quickly, and that she's not in the driver's seat after the very beginning. And just that, like Carmen said, more of an understanding about how kids, when they're developing, don't need to be trying any kind of way of eating or modifying their eating. They should be having moderate eating from all food groups. And I think I had a general understanding of that, but I guess I didn't realize that when she viewed it as a healthy thing, I trusted her because I didn't know yet how quickly the slippery slope could change things. I guess one of the other things is that, well, one of the most helpful things that we learned along the way is that parents don't cause eating disorders. We were drowning in guilt and shame, and I see that with a lot of the parents that I work with as well. We tend to spend a lot of time and energy trying to figure out how it started, why it started, what we did wrong, what we must have said or done. And even though inadvertently we may have contributed some things to it, we did not cause it. And for us, for my husband and me, when we learned that piece, it was a big change in our ability to let that guilt and shame go. And instead of wasting the energy trying to figure those things out, we were able to channel it toward Rylee's recovery. And that we knew that as soon as we learned some skills and were helped by professionals, the right professionals, we were able to learn ways that we could be a huge part of her recovery. And I guess for us, that was the turning point. And I think it's so important for parents to know that right up front, that they didn't cause it in themselves. If things come up through the family that need to be dealt with, that can be going on throughout recovery and afterwards. But just not to waste that energy on your own guilt and shame, and to just move forward with your daughter's or son's recovery.
What an empowering statement to make, Terri. I'm so grateful for the knowledge of reminding and letting parents know that they are not the cause of this, but they are indeed part of the recovery. And what a hopeful place to be able to be as a parent. Thank you for that. So Rylee, as you listen to this, I also know that you are in recovery, and I'm wondering, what were some of the steps that first started for you? What were some of the strategies that you were able to lean into to begin that journey of recovery?
So I talked a little bit about the feeling of being possessed or having almost like an outside entity controlling my thoughts. But when it first started, it like my mom said, she thought and I thought it was just me. It was my ideas. It was my wants and needs. So then when the behaviors became problematic, it was, you, Rylee, need to stop doing that. You, Rylee, need to do this differently. And then I'm pretty sure it was a service provider that advised us to kind of differentiate the eating disorder from the person. So even like give it a name, so that when we talk about it and talk about the behaviors and the thoughts and whatnot, we can separate it from me. So then instead of it being service providers and my parents versus me trying to get me to change, it was all of us, me included, against the eating disorder. And that way we were able to kind of create a united front and work together rather than kind of against each other. So we just called him Ed for eating disorder. And I don't know why we assigned him a male gender, but we did. And so if I was restricting or doing a behavior, instead of mom or whoever saying, why don't you stop doing that? It was, hey, I know Ed wants you to do this right now, but let's not let him. Let's beat him. Let's fight against him. And just using that language really made a big difference. And now in my work as a peer support worker, working with youth, I find that's one of the first things I say is separate it, because these intrusive thoughts about your body and about exercise and food, they're not you. They're a disease, a brain disease. And you're not broken or messed up. It's the disease is infiltrating your brain. So I found that for sure was very, very helpful.
Oh, that's great. And what a wonderful thing for a young person to not see themselves as broken as they begin their journey on this to recovery. Carmen, you hear how every day how hard this is for families and young people and people living with it and people supporting them. I'm wondering if you can speak a bit to how can we begin this conversation with the young people and anyone that we're worried about around an eating disorder? How can we begin? We know this can't be easy, so we'd love to hear some strategies that we can lean into for parents to be able to begin.
It's a tough one, like Terri said, where the guilt and shame can come, because why didn't I see this sooner? Or how come I didn't realize that maybe this wasn't really Rylee talking? And that's where a lot of the stuff for parents can come up, where they think I should have intervened sooner. But it's really hard for a parent, I think, to accept, number one, how serious this might be becoming, and it becomes serious quickly. And number two, this was my daughter. Like I knew who she was, or son, right? My child. I knew who they were, and this is not who they are. And to actually accept that perhaps this might be some mental illness coming into your family, that's a huge step of understanding and acceptance, to be able to get over that hump first, to be able to help your child. So I think that's kudos to you, Terri, because that's a tough one for parents. So when I think about how to approach your child, it's, of course, approaching them at a safe time, when people, of course, aren't loaded of emotional, and you're not digesting it in the middle of a conflict. So a safe time and place and it's private. And I always tell people, try to address the behaviors rather than what you see. So instead of like the weight loss or the restricting or whatever, those individuals are really clear about that stuff. What we want to try to point out to them is what we're actually seeing with their behavior. So sometimes we're seeing like increased isolation at home. They're moving away from their friends. Their moods are lower. Maybe their grades are going down at school because they're so focused on food. Lots of times they're cooking and baking, but they're not eating the food. And it's noticing that dinner times all of a sudden are becoming really kind of not so enjoyable anymore. And you can feel the tension because that person is not wanting to intake that food or all of the foods that are provided. Sometimes we see them over exercising, sometimes pulling away from extracurricular activities. So you're just noticing, this isn't my kid. So really take note. What are you actually seeing that's causing concern, and sitting down that way with a non-judgmental attitude and really being open to hearing their experience. You want to hear, what are they experiencing and what are they feeling, and validating that instead of just trying to fix it right away. because when we try to fix it right away, we shut down what somebody has to say. So we really want to validate their experience. And some of this starts with some extreme bullying for people. That's a number one way that people start to feel not okay about their body. And nowadays, whereas when I was growing up, we had just magazines or television to compare ourselves to, kids now have so many social platforms to go on. And what they do see on social platforms can be like, I mean, there's trending body types that you can find when somebody was supposed to be voluptuous, and now it's looking androgynous, to having a thigh gap, to big butts and small breasts, or vice versa. Things that are just, and now there's even skeletal shaming where you can't have hip dips and your rib cage needs to be small. And that's all there. And they're seeing this stuff constantly every day. And not only are they seeing those messages, the pictures they're seeing are so modified. They're not even real. But when you're looking at something like that and you're a teenager who's still figuring out what's my sexuality, what's my identity, who am I in this world? And we all want to fit in, especially at this time, because we're moving away from our families and more towards our social circle. And we want to fit in. And these are the messages we're getting that we need to do to fit in. So all of a sudden, somebody who's had a previously pretty good concept, pretty good body ideal, exercise for, fun and fitness, is all of a sudden taking on behaviors that are getting far more compulsive and unhealthy. And it's trying to intervene the best we can before it gets to the point where it's become a dangerous habitual pattern. So we want to identify it early, get them some support outside, an external professional. One non-negotiable that I always say is we do need some medical consultation, a physician, somebody who understands eating disorders, and the early intervention part, because it's really important also to tell somebody who's going through puberty, your body's changing. And you're going to put on some weight, and it's going to be fat, because what your body's doing is preparing to grow. We have internal organs growing. We have the external stuff going on, muscle, brain development, our reproductive system development. But if we're not aware of that, and all we see is this extra tire that's sitting there, and I'm looking like a chubby teenager, and they feel self-conscious about that, they're going to look for ways to get out. And unfortunately, they go to the internet. And it's not always the healthiest place to reach out to for information.
Thank you for that, Carmen. And as parents, hearing really loudly and for young people, early intervention is always the goal. So I appreciate you've given some insight to things that we can pay attention to and begin on. And speaking to that, I mean, every body shape, all those different things we have to consider. So I think about that too, that we can be healthy at any weight. Will you speak a bit to that as a strategy for informing and educating?
Yeah, I wanted to speak a little bit about protective factors and moving into health at every size, which I think is really where, if people want to change health habits, that's where it needs to go. But with protective factors, I've spoke about family connectedness. And one part that keeps that family communication and connectedness is externalizing the physical part. Because if you start to get into a fight about eat what's on your plate, and getting into that controversy, you need to gain weight or whatever it is that the person's needing to do, we need the medical doctor to kind of play that role so that you can maintain your relationship with your child and they can continue to trust you. And it takes so much stress off the parent because that's a lot of roles to play. The media literacy part I've spoken to. Schools are doing such a better job at this, but continuing to try to have that conversation with your kid about what they are seeing and how do they interpret it without judgment, just listening to understand their world and what they're facing, because it's very different from what we did growing up. The other one is inclusive and fun physical activity, because it's not always about competition and performance. And when we push that, It can move somebody away from actually enjoying being physically active. And what we want to do is have people just move their bodies, and it doesn't have to be a traditional hit the gym and push the weights and run. It could be gardening. It could be trampolining. It could be skateboarding. It could be paddling. It's one way just to get movement into somebody's body and the joy of moving, and not just crunching the calories and trying to make yourself a certain shape or size, right? And we know that when people enjoy something, they do it more, right? And that also is going to benefit our health. We know that school connectedness is a protective factor. So when somebody feels connected, whether it's to a teacher, a counselor, their friends, and not only the connectedness, and parents are also connected to the school and feel invited and welcome. And the other one that I think schools could do a better job, and not just schools, all of us, is where we tend to label food good or bad. Oh, that's bad for you. Oh, that you're eating too much junk food. Like, we really need to take that paradigm and throw that in the garbage. We have to look at saying, well, what's more nutritious? How about that's a high energy food? You're going to be playing soccer. Great idea for that. Here's some sometimes foods, and here's some everyday foods. All foods can fit into that spectrum, every single food, and good and bad. There is no moral value or ethical value to how we eat. And that is an old dieting strategy that needs to be put into the garbage. And Health at Every Size supports this whole, the protective factors, basically. Health at Every Size is basically a premise that you're improving health in a way that you're honoring your body and not harming it. And what we're looking at is trying to have an intuitive and flexible approach to food, that pleasure does play a role. So we think about what we do in society when we get together with people and enjoy each other. What do? We eat, right? So we want to remember that that's also about pleasure, but we have to start to remembering a more intuitive form, and really judging from your internal cues, whether you're hungry and sometimes we overeat, and that's okay. But sometimes we're going to undereat, and that's okay. And it's going to depend on our amount of activity as well, how much we're doing. So it's a flexible, intuitive approach to honor our internal cues of satiety, of fullness, hunger, and how much we're moving.
Carmen, thank you so much. I know you've given a lot for our viewers to consider, and myself, I'm learning so much, and knowing that there's some language I even need to change in my own self-talk and to those around me. So thank you. So Rylee, you've heard lots of talk about different things, and you have spoken to how you support young people. I'm wondering if there's any last thoughts you have of things that you'd like to share to make sure that you get across to our viewers today.
Carmen, you hit on most everything that I wanted to say, which is good. But in working with youth, another thing that Carmen said that to stand out is just to acknowledge that they're in a crazy time when it comes to social media and connectivity and exposure to everything. I remember when I was sick, I was definitely subscribing to lots of those Fitspo and Thinspo accounts, and that played a big role in, every day I look at them and go, why can't I look like that? And in my mind, it was, I just haven't sacrificed enough. Those people are strong, and they're morally up here, and I'm down here because I haven't sacrificed enough. I haven't suffered enough. So the whole moralization of food and exercise and bodies, it almost became, it was embedded into my moral system. I thought people who restricted and pushed themselves, they were good. And people who indulged and were lazy were bad. And so I was going to do everything I could to be good. And then it was just enforced by all the accounts and whatnot that I followed. And so I'd say advice, if you're working with someone with an eating disorder, with them, probably against their wishes, do a cleanse of their social media platforms. And that's not saying delete Instagram and delete everything, because there are lots of good on the opposite spectrum, like body positive accounts and whatnot. But then again, with those, you still need to be careful to make sure that they're the messages that they're actually giving. But that's a huge part, working with young people nowadays, to go through their social media and just unfollow, unsubscribe to anything pertaining to diet or bodies, And I know that's really hard. I have one youth and she said, well, I don't even follow any accounts, but I still get ads all the time on my Facebook about diets and whatnot. And she's like, I've never even searched that on Facebook, but it just shows up. So even just having that conversation with them and having them be aware of all these kind of potential triggers, so that when they see them, instead of getting launched into the eating disorder thinking, they can kind of come at it from more of a analytical view, and they can look at it and say, okay, what is this ad trying to sell me? And that would be very, very helpful. So yeah, media literacy more.
And I agree, like with what the role you play as a peer support person, because I think if a mom or a dad tried to do this, there would be a little bit more hit back. But I think coming from somebody their own age who sits down and says, let's look at this, like what's going to be helpful mentally here and what's not, they're going to be way more open to that. And that's a wonderful approach.
Thank you so much. Terri, any final thoughts that you have around anything you'd like to share with families as they watch and learn from us today?
One thing that I'd love to share that we learned along the way is there are 4 C's that you can try to remember. One is communication, so keep those communication lines open, like Carmen and Rylee both alluded to. And that means, like Rylee said, separating the disorder and working with your child as a team, and getting the mindset that this is the family's recovery. This isn't just her recovery. We're in this together. The next one is calm. So trying to stay calm through it all, which is really, really difficult because a lot of times you're panicking. The medicine for eating disorders is food, and it's the thing that they will do anything to avoid. So you can imagine how difficult that can be. But if you can remain calm in the household, that it really makes a big difference. Compassion, like I said, they are sick. They deserve the same kind of compassion as though they had a broken bone or diabetes or any example that I could give. They're ill and they deserve that. And the last one is confidence. And I struggled with that at first because I said, how can I appear confident when I don't know yet how to do this? I don't know what to do. But 2 things. One is this person said, fake it till you make it. So while you're learning, say things like, we've got this. I don't know totally how we're going to get through this yet, but we're going to do it together. You're not alone. We're going to do it. We're going to get better. And Rylee has shared that when we talked about the future, when you're better, that seemed to help her a little bit too, that we were going to get out of this. And then the other thing that I thought is really important for parents to know is that when you do learn, if you have to learn more explicit skills like emotion coaching and meal support and meal planning, those aren't things you should know what to do. They need to be explicitly taught to you, and there shouldn't be guilt around the fact that you need professionals to help you to learn those things. The last thing I wanted to mention is just to validate them. And even if it seems way out there, like it will, the things that they're believing and choosing and the things that Ed is making them believe, to still validate, like things like, I can imagine how scary it must be for you to eat that right now. Or I understand how uncomfortable it is for you right now when you're full. And just reminding them that they're not alone, you're there. And again, that the healing journey is that it's a journey and you're going to get there together.
Thank you so much, Terri. What hopeful messages to end on. I thank you all for your wisdom, your caring to share your experiences and stories with us today. And I know that it's giving a lot of insight for people to be able to go away with and begin. And so as you begin and as you go off on your own, please be kind to yourself as you find your ways and how you can connect in. The one loud message I heard is it's relationship first. And I know that we can all pause a moment to listen more and speak less so that we can be there to help the ones we care about. And so glad you joined us today. And yeah, wishing you ease and kindness as you find your way in all of this. Take care.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria.
Thanks for joining me.